Come along on my creative journey in designing and fashioning a new Florentine Renaissance gown known as a Gamurra. Accompany me through all of the sometimes frustrating stages, from conception and patterning through to construction and finishing. There will be plenty of lessons learned and cheeky commentary along the way. Well, everyone, we're on the road again. This whole project is basically being done on the road. I'm not certain I've actually worked on it in a place where I currently reside. No, that's not true. The sleeves. I worked on the sleeves in a place where I currently reside. Anyway, so the skirts. We're at the stage where we will need to baste all of the blue interlining bits, the parts that reach down just past my hips, to the skirt. So let's go ahead and I'll demonstrate how to go about doing this. And the first step, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be ironing, because this poor thing has been hauled from pillar to post, and linen, pure linen, takes a crease like nothing else. So let's start with ironing, shall we? I actually have an ironing board and an iron. Oh, I think I have an iron. I have an ironing board. We'll find out. Let's go. So yeah, I seem to have dreamt that I saw an ironing board and an iron here. Ironically, I did find an antique iron back there too. There's a much cleaner looking one over there. And I'm seriously considering popping one of these bad boys into the oven or putting it on the stove and heating it up and trying it out. Honestly, I've been wanting to try one of these antique irons out because they're closer to what people would have used in the Middle Ages. We'll see what happens here in a moment. You might see me try this or not. Well, we did find an iron, so I'm sorry everyone, you're not going to get to see me experiment with a Victorian iron heated up over the stove, at least not this time. Well, we'll see how froggy I'm feeling. I might do a little experiment just to show you what that's like, but not on the fabric I'm actually going to be using on this garment, because I'm confident that there's a lot of art to using a Victorian iron, and I'm confident that I'm going to need to damage some scrap fabric before I master that art. So we're ironing this all out so that it'll make it nice and easy to make my marks to do the diagonal bias cut. Next up, we are going to cut the edging to go around the arm's eye of the bodice and around the neckline. From experience, I know that using bias cut strips is way easier because you can manipulate it around the edges. So I think I might go ahead and go with bias cut strips to make it easier to manipulate around these curves. I'm actually not certain. In the original done by Beato Sana, I guess, check and see if I can find any details on whether the finishing strips on the neckline are bias cut or not. Maybe I can tell by looking at a close-up of the neckline whether the grain is like this or like this around the edging. With this at any rate, we're gonna go with bias cut strips, so let's go. Well, I don't have a measuring tape with me, and I wanna get a vague idea of how much of this bias cut strip I'm going to need, so I have this ribbon, and I'm just going to use it as a measuring tool. So I'm just going to put it here and sort of ease it along the neckline. I don't want an exact measurement, or I don't really need an exact measurement, but I just want an idea of how much I'm going to need, so that I don't cut endless strips that are unessential. Sort of working it along. It's funny how much I end up MacGyvering when I'm sewing, creating tools out of nothing. Looks like about a yard actually I'm going to need just for the neckline. And I will repeat that for the arm size. Just going to make a mark here, marking where the neckline was. And that is about how much I will need. The interesting thing about this fabric, and the very convenient thing, is that it actually, because of the twill weave, we actually have diagonal lines built into it. And the diagonal lines run exactly perpendicular across the grain. So I can actually line up my straight edge, in this case a Jungi magnet or game board from Korea, and line those up right with the stripes that are there to make sure that I'm getting the perfect 95-degree line, so yay. While I mark up this wool with tailor's soap, let's chat briefly about wool production in the 15th century. I know, a truly sexy topic. Although many fellow explorers of historical fashion are tempted to explore and master every stage of textile production, the wool industry of medieval Europe was highly specialized, involving dozens of separate professions and sub-professions, most of which fell under the purview of powerful wool guilds. Medieval Europe's economy was driven by wool, and the guilds kept that market tightly buttoned. Wool production being far more complex than silk, the people involved in the process included carders, combers, spinners, weavers, fullers, nappers, shearers, and dyers, just to name some of them. By the 15th century in Florence, the wool firms were often outsourcing many of the earlier stages of production, paying on a piece rate basis, rather than hiring employees to handle production in-house. The wool companies owned the raw materials and paid for their processing by each individual contractor. This level of specialization enabled artisans to achieve a truly exquisite level of mastery, which is why spinners in the 15th century could produce thread that people these days would mistake for machine-made, whereas my hand-spun thread looks like yarn made by a 2-year-old. If you are enjoying this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe and the notification bell if you want to know when I launch new things. And if you want to do more to support my work, then consider the super thanks button on YouTube or maybe becoming a patron on Patreon, which comes with a whole host of perks and extras like access to premium tutorials, multiple hour ones in fact, and discounts on classes. And now back to your regularly scheduled Contessa. Now that the strips are cut, I'm actually going to move on to preparing the skirts and save the application of the bias cut strips for later, because I can apply bias cut strips to bodice edging in a tight space like an airplane. But airlines get really upset if you just break out an iron and start ironing things mid-flight. I don't know what it is. You see, I'm conducting this project mostly while traveling. Most of the major sewing is happening in airplanes or airport lounges and whatnot. So now that I have the space to accomplish these sort of bigger tasks like ironing and laying things out, I'm taking care of all of that in preparation for my next return flight, which is going to be back to Korea. Okay, so I ironed this all out and laid this out and was preparing to actually pin and then baste the lining and the shell of the skirt together, but I remembered now that my actual plan is to first put a hem, a rolled hem, a double hem in the bottom of this, as is seen in the lining of Osana's. And I'm going to do that, unfortunately for the other pieces which I've already finished, I forgot to do that, and I did it after I already assembled the lining and the interlining and even did put the skirts together in those parts. But instead, I'm going to go ahead and take my lessons learned, and I'm going to go ahead and put in the hem now and sew it in now before I attach it all together, so that I don't have to be manipulating this and maybe the rest of the skirts when I put the hem in to finish up this lining. So let's go ahead and do a double hem. I start by pinning at one end, putting in a roll and pinning at one end. Sort of, I just roll it once, then twice. And I can already tell as I work along that because see, here's the thing, if I just do that, then it runs off the edge, right? For those of you who know how to do a double hem, you can either listen to me talk or skip ahead. But for those who don't know how to do a double rolled hem, I will show you. So what I know is that I need to keep this along the curve. So I manipulate it, I pin it a little bit, instead of pinning it flat like that, I actually pin it upward so that the grain of the hemmed part aligns with the grain of the fabric directly above it, right? And that will help me keep this where it needs to be for this hem. So that, and that means that as I go along, they're going to be sort of tiny ease tucks that we'll be kind of working in as we go along here. And you'll notice I like to put my pins in each pin dives and emerges several times, and that's because I am traveling with this. No doubt it's going to go in a car and I'm going to work on it on the way to somewhere else. And if I don't do that with the pins just fall out. On the subject of pinning things, pins have a long history in the archaeological record, one that goes beyond the obvious uses. For instance, the ancient Egyptians used pins made of fine fish bones to hold shut the lids of corpses during the mummification process. Although pins were originally fashioned of easy-to-obtain natural materials such as bone and thorns, by the 13th century in Europe, metal had taken over as the primary material used to fashion pins. Pins were costly and valuable enough to be mentioned mentioned not only in purchase records, but in wedding trousseau inventories. For instance, Princess Joan, daughter of Edward III of England, apparently had some 12,000 pins in the ship-sized wedding trousseau that accompanied her to her sadly never-to-happen wedding in Castile. Alas, she died of the Black Death en route in Bordeaux. Medieval Europe's economy seems to have literally been held together by pins. In the 15th century, there are records of a Venetian merchant vessel arriving in London with a boatload of pins from Flanders, and various English kings passed legislation forbidding the import of cheaper foreign wares and assuring the quality of domestically made pins. More evidence of just how international and interconnected the medieval world was, and also that protectionism is not a new concept. Okay, and there we have it. There is the pinning. Onward with the hemming, and I'm just going to do a long running stitch for that. I've chosen to use a running stitch here because that is what is used on this section of Osana's gown. Unsurprisingly, running stitches appear in medieval garments throughout the entire period, especially in places that are not under great strain or friction. Unless something goes hideously wrong, this part of the garment should never ever end up on the ground. Although I'm confident that statement will engender many comments in the video. Please try to keep it rated PG. As I go along, I make certain that this is not bunched up, and so I kind of I make certain that the thread has not gathered this down like that, for instance, right? So make certain that if you're doing a running stitch that you, as you work along, make certain that nothing is gathered up that shouldn't be. Well, now that all of these hems are finished, I then proceed to baste each separate lining to each separate skirt panel, and then we prepare the skirts for assembly. I line them up outside to outside so that the inside is facing out, and use a T-square to draw a very wonderful, perfect straight line down the edge. Immediately after making the marking, I go ahead and baste. Now I'm going to assemble these skirts in groups, so I'll assemble 2 panels and then 2 panels and then attach those 2 sets of 2 panels, which is what comes next. Right, well, we have finished basting the skirt panels together, and so now I am going to go ahead and sew along the marked line with what I call a running back stitch, because the skirts do not, at least in this direction, are not subject to great forces. I'm not going to do a full back stitch all the way up. That would just be a waste of time, and a lot of medieval skirts, or pieces of medieval skirts that have survived, it's actually more, it's either a running stitch, a tight running stitch, or this kind of stitch that I've just discussed. And then we'll turn the edges and finish the hem, creating this kind of stiffening effect that will also give our skirts some fullness. So if you just heard that growling, that's my father-in-law's dog. Anyway, so onward with the sewing. So I am once again using double thread here because even though this isn't a high traffic area per se, I'm just hard on my garments, so yeah, double thread here. The main thing to remember when you're working with wool, especially this kind of wool, is that it is a 3-dimensional fabric. To wit, you must note that where your needle goes in on the top might not be the same spot at which your needle comes out on the bottom. So that's why I'm constantly turning and sort of looking to check to make sure that I'm still actually on the line. And I've actually drawn the line on both sides of the fabric so that I have a frame of reference for what is considered a straight stitch on both sides. On the positive side, any fabric this thick tends to be rather forgiving, so that even if the stitch isn't technically perfectly straight, it will look pretty okay from the front. And to clarify, a running back stitch is basically a back stitch where you don't have the stitches meet, where you put a little bit of space between each stitch. Next, I trim the excess blue lining, and actually I'm going to trim it down so that the seam allowance on the blue lining is half as much as the seam allowance on the wool of the skirt. Because what we're going to do here is actually turn the wool around over top of the linen so that it encases the linen edge entirely. On our next enthralling episode, we're going to be finishing up the skirts. I will also be discussing some contemporary chronicles that detail how these clothes were worn. We will be coming back also to the topic of sumptuary laws and how to break them. and maybe finally finishing this damned dress. It could happen. Have you ever had a project that's dragged on for multiple years? Let me know your experience in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, stay creative and stay tuned for your moment of feline felicity.